David, how old were you when you arrived in Vietnam?
I was just 28. Someone once was later doing a study on how people turned on the war. It was a study of intellectuals at Columbia, and it turned out that the two people who had had the most profound effect in changing intellectual opinion were Bernard Fall and myself. He first, me second. And so they were interviewing us on how we changed, and I said it was easy. I was a 28-year-old kid thrown out of a helicopter, and I found that it didn't work. And out of that became the long, complicated process of mutation, of political and social mutation, and looking at why it didn't work and what it meant.
Why the war didn't work.
Why the war did not work.
Well, look, as a correspondent, I was a World War II correspondent, and I saw different wars, and things were clear blacks and whites, and the enemy was a bad guy.
Clear definition of national purpose, a policy that worked, that had the solid support of the citizenry, had a declaration of war behind it, as opposed to in Vietnam, a policy, and this is important, you cannot understand what the correspondents did there unless you see them as a kind of dew line or a trip flare for a false policy, a failed policy, a policy begun in ignorance, secrecy. Lyndon Johnson and Scotty Reston's phrase, took us to war by stealth, lied about everything. He and McNamara lied at every increment. An absolute misunderstanding of the other side, of its toughness and resilience and capacity to keep coming. They thought it would be a short war, the bombing would work, American technology would work. And they also had an almost absolute misunderstanding of their own allies out there. The other side was, the French Indochina War had made the other side tough, dynamic, modern, resourceful, brave. Our allies, when we talk about an ARV in general, you're talking about a former French corporal. They had sat alongside the French, fought alongside the French during a war of independence. They were in effect a quisling army. They were twice defeated. And there was a comparable overestimation in Washington of their prowess. And out of that, since there was almost no reporting by correspondents in Washington who played the institutional game, we in Vietnam became the point man of a policy that was dying in front of our eyes. And we were torn, in contrast to the correspondents of World War II and Korea, where there was a great legitimacy of purpose and of policy. We became caught between traditional definitions of loyalty, patriotism, salute the flag, and a higher definition, it seemed to me, in our own minds of democracy, the need to tell the truth on something that was a lie. And that's caused attention.
Did you feel that your patriotism was called into question?
Called into question all the time, and there's a part of me that still bitterly resents it. My father, I'm a child of immigrants and of immigrant family, and my love for this country and its freedoms is very great. My father was a medic underage in World War I, and he was a combat surgeon overage in World War II. And I have heard more shots, and he and I have heard more shots fired in anger than most of the Saigon generals who denigrated it. General Krulak denigrated it. Maggie Higgins once came out. She was a spokesman, a journalistic spokesman for the Pentagon, and she went around telling everybody that Halberstam had seen a picture of Viet Cong bodies, and with that he had burst into tears. And I went over, I once grabbed Krulak, who was the one, General Krulak, Marine Krulak, who was telling this, and I grabbed him at the airport. He's very small, and I am very large. And I put my finger in his face, and I said, "You're full of shit." And I never cried. I mean, this was my manhood, which was at stake. And I argued with him, and I just told him, "Don't ever put crap like that out again." My old friend, Jack Langeth, who was later a New York Times correspondent in Saigon, now dean of, not dean, but a professor at Southern Cal in journalism, and a wonderful man, godfather of my child. Jack later said that the truth was that I should have cried, and he was right, that it was a definition of, but it was a new definition of manhood, but it was true. I remember another confrontation. Dick Tregaskis was in Vietnam, and he was a hero to me. He was a classic World War II correspondent. He'd written a book called Guadalcanal Diary, which was the first celebration of the possibility of American victory in World War II, and I liked him and I admired him. Here was a hero come, and I took him with me down to the Delta where I had great sources, and we had a very pleasant day together, 2 days together. And on the way back, we were sitting in a car, and at one point he turned to me, voice never raised, and he looked at me and he said, "If I were doing what you're doing, I would be ashamed of myself." And we did not speak for the rest of the way. I am sure my face was an ashen gray. It was like pulling a stake out of your heart. I mean, later there were, President Kennedy asked the publisher of the New York Times to pull me out. That meant nothing. This stake, this statement from Tregaskis about loyalty, patriotism, duty, was far more painful because it came in a way from a hero and from my own profession. And what I realized years later, that it was the classic confrontation between the World War II correspondent and the new generation out of Vietnam.
I remember a story you wrote once about an old friend of mine, Homer Biggert, with whom I covered the war in the Philippines, about Biggert and Neil Sheehan. You recall that?
It's the only story you ever needed to know about Vietnam and about the war and about the press. It was very early in 1962. Homer was my predecessor, and he is, I think, along with Peter Arnett of this war, probably the great war correspondent of our century to dead heat. Peter, by doing 9 years in Vietnam, may have achieved greater eminence as a war correspondent. But Homer had been there, and he brought that abiding shrewdness of many wars and many difficult places to it. And he and Neil, who was just later, Neil was a great reporter of Vietnam, did the Pentagon Papers, but he was a 25-year-old kid, and he knew he had to learn how to be a correspondent, so he just followed Homer wherever he went. And they just got in the American helicopters down to Mito, where the 7th ARVN Division was, and they went down. They would have 3 days of famous victories, and 3 days of battles, 3 days of victories. And they went out, and the first day, there was a mild victory, battle, organization. Next day, classic ARVN pillow punching thing, arranged so that the other side could get away. Third day, the same thing, deliberately arranged so that there would be no conflict. They knew where the ARVN, the Viet Cong were. They just didn't choose to go after them. And on the way back, they were driving back to Saigon from Mito, and kind of Neil was very young, and he goes, mumbling, wasted time, 3 days, wasted time. And Homer said, Mr. Sheehan, what's the problem, Mr. Sheehan? And Neil said, well, 3 days wasted, no story. Ah, says Homer, there is a story, Mr. Sheehan. It doesn't work, Mr. Sheehan. That's your story.
How long had you been there before you realized it just wasn't working?
I would say about 3. I mean, the day I arrived, there was an expulsion party for Francois Souly, who was a Newsweek correspondent who'd been there 10 years or so. And the tempers and the bitterness was already there, and I felt that I had to make my judgments my own, and I had always worked in a certain way before in the Congo. I'd been in combat in the Congo. I was a little bit of a war correspondent before there. I'd been nicked. Not really wounded, nicked. I'd almost won a Pulitzer Prize, and the Congo got beat out by Walter Lippmann. He in his aging years, me in my new ones. So I mean, I wasn't the brand new kid that the PAOs and the MACV people tried to make out. And I decided, as I did in the Congo, that I would not just listen in Saigon. I would move around, and I also decided I would pick a couple critical areas, because it's such a scattered war. There were so many wars going on. There would be critical areas, and I would keep going back. I'd pick them out, and I'd use them as my litmus papers. And I picked Mito, the 7th Division. There turned out to be a legendary figure down there who was the division advisor, Colonel John Paul Vann. Neil Sheehan's finishing up a book on him now, and it's going to be an important book on that war. And I kept going back, and it became very clear in about 3 months that we weren't winning the war, we weren't fighting it, we were losing it, that the other side had greater dynamism, and that the war was a sham, that what was being said in Saigon by the generals was a sham, American generals. It came to a head at the Battle of Oppach, I think it was January 1st or 2nd, 1963, where all the things that the American advisors had been complaining about, the failure to attack, the cowardliness, the fact that the ARVN colonels were all political appointees rather than reaching position on the basis of ability and courage. They had a Viet Cong battalion trapped in a tree line, and they deliberately let them out. And the colonels, John Vann was furious, and we covered it, and they almost relieved Vann. Here's this passionate American advisor, and they were going to relieve him for being angry over a defeat. They weren't going to be angry at the Arvin colonel who didn't attack. They were going to relieve the American advisor for being so tough. As John said, they keep telling me that I made them lose face. I'm not here to save their face. I'm here to save their ass. So, I mean, out of that, from then on, you knew that it was a false. It took us, I think Neil, me, Peter, and others, a long time in the mutation I mentioned to understand completely why, that it wasn't just that ZM was incompetent, that ZM was a symptom, a feudal, the last mandarin, a reflection of a dying order. That the important thing to know about ZM was he had sat on the sidelines during the French Indochina War. That when you were talking about this general or that, you were talking about men who had fought alongside the French. That the other side had the resilience, the dynamism, and that it could not be done. It took I think that by the end of '63, Neil and I expect some of the others, began to realize that the roots were in the French Indochina War.
You mentioned a moment ago that President Kennedy asked your editors to pull you out of Vietnam. How did that pressure manifest itself? What did they do?
Get on the team. What, do you have any problems out in Vietnam, General Harkins? My only problem, sir, this is to McNamara, is the American press. Think about that. Think about that. An American democracy, and your only problem is the press. Think of what a press is in a democracy. We ask the questions for the people. We try and do a we try and report. We try and tell what's happening. If your only problem is the press, then you've got a lot bigger problem. Ambassador Nolting once told me I was always looking for the hole in the donut, threw me out of his office. Constant assaults upon our patriotism and manhood. In Washington, out of the White House, Kenny O'Donnell, who should have known better, Kennedy's, all those people, McNamara, people like Krulak. We were portrayed as communists. This was very bitter, we were portrayed as people who sat around the Caravel Hotel all the time drinking instead of going out on operations somewhere. I've got an air medal from a helicopter company and a combat infantry badge given to me by officers because I'd been with them that much, which are treasured mementos. I mean, those things were just constantly attempted. If you could not challenge the reporting, challenge the legitimacy of the person who did it. It was very ugly stuff. And we were young. You see, the idea, none of us had made our reputations yet. Now, Peter Arnett later has a Pulitzer Prize and almost won two. In fact, he won it and they pulled it away from him second time. Horst Foss, who was out there, has two Pulitzer Prizes. Mal Brown has one. Neil Sheehan won one for the Times with the Pentagon Papers. I won one. I mean, Charlie Moore should have won one. I mean, Bill Toohey. I mean, later, now we look like a group that is almost historic. By the time we were 26-year-old kids.
Were you caught in a crossfire, a conflict between those who were covering the Pentagon in Washington, the headquarters correspondent in Washington, and the combat correspondent in the field? What happened on that?
Well, the failure of the press in Vietnam, and there is a failure. I mean, we out there weren't as good as we should have been, but the people who really failed were the people who covered institutional Washington in those days. Because here you had this policy built on lies, misconceptions of who the other side was, lies about what the troop levels were and whatever, and nobody in Washington ever covered it. So you had a false policy built on lies and fear. Lyndon Johnson didn't go in to help the Vietnamese. He went in because he didn't want to lose Saigon, because of the fears of the fall of China. He thought if he lost Saigon and Ho Chi Minh walked into Saigon, he'd lose his great society. So it was absolutely pure political fear on his part. But that didn't translate out there. So we're catching all the hell for bad policy. We're the ones who are the tripwire. The policy is being shown in Washington as a legitimate policy, and nobody's picking at it and showing the flaws in it. And these guys, I mean, the government was very skilled. There's a Pentagon propaganda machine, and they know how to put out the stories they want through Washington. I mean, you know, they used to fly generals out in the old days when I was there just to arrive at Saigon to give what we used to call the arrival speech. A general would arrive. He'd never been in Saigon, didn't know anything. And he would get up and they'd have a press conference. He'd say, I sense a great national victory. President Odin Zem is greatly respected as turning the country around. I think we'll have, things are beginning to go our way. No one thought this war was easy, but we're pleased with results. It would be kind of an airport arrival speech. Neil Sheehan would nudge me and say, another foolish Westerner come to lose his reputation to Ho Chi Minh.
You then saw pretty clearly that this, in your view, was an extension of American politics out there.
No, I think it took a while. I think there was a disillusionment. I think, started out there, just simply didn't work, and we fought it, began to trace it back. I mean, I have this feeling now because later I came back and did a book on the origins of the policy making. You know, it was a book called The Best and Brightest, and I spent 4 years on it. How did it go wrong? How did they make these wrong decisions? But what's interesting is, again, it was a reporter from Vietnam who did it, not anybody in Washington who did it. No, it took us a long time to understand the miscalculations. I didn't even start on that book till 7 years after I first arrived in Vietnam.
Did you have free access? Was transportation provided by the military to you?
It was very hard in the early days. Later it became quite good, but in those days it was very controlled. You had a list, and you had to wait like on a batting order, and it was hard to get around. It was a deliberate way of, I think, of keeping us away, and it was hard for a while. We used to drive down. We used to get in these old cabs and driven, it seemed by Vietnamese who wanted to go to Le Mans, and we would drive down to Mito through VC area, get shot at all the time. Rather exciting, you know. You never knew if you'd make it. Now, you tried not to do it at night, though, because then they really owned the territory at night. And it got better later when the first squadron of armed helicopters got out there, because we had a friend who was the first commandant of them, and he would take us on any time he wanted. And one time, an American PIO came out there and said, tried to get aboard, and said, I hear you're taking reporters. And the commandant, then Major, later Colonel Ivan Slavich, who was a wonderful man, said, get the hell out of here. I'll take any goddamn person I want on these helicopters. These are my helicopters. These are my friends. You're not my friend. Get off my company grounds. Wonderful moment for us. But it was a constant struggle. I remember in the fall of '63, there had been a battle down way in the Delta, and it had not gone well. And we had tried very hard to get on, and we'd called Ambassador Lodge and Harkins's office and people like that, and couldn't get on. And later, they had a slick new general out there, Dick Stilwell. I guess by then he had 2 stars. He's now #2 in the Defense Department. One of the smoothest operators. I mean, no matter what's going wrong, Dick Stilwell's career is going to keep rising up. And he was a slick briefer, and he came back, he'd been to the battle, and he kind of gave us a briefing about it. And, you know, it was a defeat, but he made it seem like a victory. He kind of told us what the Arvin colonel had had for breakfast. I mean, the implied pseudo-information of a fake briefing. And then he said, now, gentlemen, and he treated us as if we were corporals. This is a very busy war. Ambassador Lodge is very busy. General Harkins is very busy. And it would really be much better in the future if you don't bother them on this. I mean, please don't call them. We don't have time for you. And in a way, it was a terribly important moment for me in terms of democracy. I mean, I was 28 at the time, and I was a kid, but I knew that something was at stake. And I got up and I said, the people who sent me out here, the editors of the New York Times, sent me out to go to that battle. They didn't send me here, nor did these other people get sent here, to be briefed in Saigon when we don't know whether to vouch for your word or not, and to take only one man's view. And until they tell us that they want us to come home, we're going to stay here, we're going to keep reporting, and we're going to keep calling Harkins and Lodge and you until we get out there, because that's our job. We don't tell you how to do your job, and we're going to keep going. And it was a voice beyond me. I never had that voice in me before. I mean, I was always taught to be respectful, but it was about the right of a press corps, and it was, to me, as pure a voice of a democratic impulse. I looked over and I saw another friend of mine, General York, who was the only general I ever saw combat, and he looked at me at the end of it, and I thought, oh, I've lost a friend. He looked, and he winked. It was a great moment for me.
David, I remember in Italy in World War II, we were based in Rome. The front was up above Florence, several miles. We could fly to Florence, go to the front, cover a firefight, get back to Rome that night, and have a pleasant meal down on the Via Condotti. Anything like that occur in Vietnam?
We had a very surrealistic war in Vietnam because of the helicopters. You could get up in the morning at 3 a.m., take a ride out to Tan Son Nhut, get in a helicopter, watch the sun come up over the Mekong Delta in a hot helicopter, which is really the most beautiful thing you can imagine, go into battle, which was terrifying. I mean, if the VC had 20 caliber, 50 caliber machine guns, the helicopter is quite vulnerable to that. And, you know, we were losing helicopters and losing the people in it. And there's no place to hide in a helicopter. You can't hunker down. I mean, you're there. And the sense of being exposed is phenomenal. We go through a day of battle. And then on the way back, if we made it, we'd turn around and go back, and we'd go out. And there was Saigon, was still a French city of these wonderful restaurants and beautiful meals. And I remember Ivan Slavich, the commander of the helicopter, saying, "Want to have dinner tonight with us?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And Neil Sheehan would say, yeah. Then Mert Perry, who was the only one of us who was married, said, no, I can't. I think my wife's cooking something, and Ivan got on the phone, on the horn to his men back at Tonson and said, look, and got Mert's phone number and said, will you tell Mrs. Perry at 22154 that not to cook and to come and join us for dinner tonight. Her husband's okay, we're on the way home. I mean, it was quite surrealistic. And that sort of camaraderie of war, of bravery, the knowledge that death could be right around the corner, that makes everything larger and more real. That moment where everything is so finely clear in your mind. Those moments are etched in you forever.
David, I remember a piece you wrote some years ago about a German colleague of yours, Horst Fast was his name, and something he said about the way Vietnam appeared to him.
He said, yes, we'd been together in the Congo, and Horst is a very talented man. He's sort of a poetic man. He said, Dave, when I first got there, you won't believe it. He said, you go into the Delta, the water buffaloes, the peasants, the rice, the ducks, pineapple trees, everything, he said, like a page out of the Bible. And then we would come in with our not-so-biblical helicopters, and things would get a little hairy.
David, do you think that the free press, which you've certainly defended and worked for and in which you live, do you think that the free press in our democracy has brought about a condition where it will be quite impossible to sell another war like Vietnam to the American people?
There are no impossibilities, Clete. Nothing, never is a long time. And there are no impossibilities. We are, as a nation, involuntarily tempered by battlefield defeat. And as such, we did not, as at Henry Kissinger's suggestion, send advisors to Angola. And we've been a little bit more modest about El Salvador than the President of the United States and the former Secretary of State, Al Haig, wanted to be. I mean, I think they wanted to redo Vietnam, and there was a feeling in the press and in the Congress that was not there in Vietnam, that be careful about planting the flag. It's easier to plant the flag than to unplant it. That every young man killed in the beginning becomes a rationale, not for an examination, a re-examination of the policy, but a rationale, and this is the most dangerous thing, for sending more young men. Remember when I was in Vietnam the first time, 90 men had died, 100 men, and people saying we can't let them down. And today in Washington there is this eloquent monument with 50,000 names on it. You go there and you cry. But I think anybody who says that it will never happen again is wrong. I think democracy is a fragile tissue. There is a constant conflict between forces, the forces of free speech, the definitions of what national interest and national purpose is, what serves that purpose, the power of the Pentagon, the power of the CIA, and the national security interest, as opposed to the more cloaked as they are always in flag and patriotism and certitude, is a hard match for a free press, which is cloaked mostly in doubt and made vulnerable because it is going against the flag. The people who will have to be in El Salvador are not going to be me and Horst and Peter and Mal. They're going to be young men. They are young men like Ray Bonner, who again have to make their reputation. So someone says, who is this guy Bonner? How dare he? You know, he's got no reputation. It was very funny. In the old days, they used to always say about people like Peter and me that we were too young. And then suddenly Peter Arnett shows up at El Salvador, and Time magazine writes, finally some smart, wise, veteran reporters like Peter Arnett arrived, and the coverage got better.
David, do you think in this world of rapidly changing technology, a world in which people are only microseconds away from each other, that in any future war, if one should come to pass, that it will be possible to maintain any kind of secrecy or any kind of censorship?
Oh, I think if there's a real war with a real declaration of war and a consensus of national purpose and the sense that the society's survival is at stake, you could have censorship, or you could have unofficial, acknowledged self-censorship. I think the question is the politics of the war. Is the society's survival at stake? And when that is true, and therefore there is a consensus of approval within the society and thus in the press, you can do these things. When it is so clearly a war of luxury, and indeed a dubious war of luxury, of a kind of an imperial moment in America, and which generates so much doubt, I think it's almost impossible to bring on censorship, because the people who are declaring that war know from the beginning, I mean, who are starting the war, not declaring it, that they are on so fragile a reed that they dare not go for a declaration. Lyndon Johnson could not have gotten a war in Vietnam by going to Congress and saying, I'm going to send 500,000 troops, and the heaviest bombing in the history of mankind. The country wouldn't have allowed him. The Congress would have pulled back. So he had to go in by stealth in secret increments, 50,000. When he went for 100,000, he announced it as 50. When he went for 2, he announced it as 100,000. And for the same reason, he doesn't dare demand censorship. So I think these things have their own inherent balances and proportions.